A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke.
Glory to you, O Lord.
The tax collectors and sinners were all drawing near to listen to Jesus. But the Pharisees and scribes began to complain, saying, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." So to them he addressed this parable. A man had 2 sons, and the younger son said to his father, "Father, give me the share of your estate that should come to me." So the father divided the property between them. After a few days, the younger son collected all his belongings and set off to a distant country where he squandered his inheritance on a life of dissipation. When he had freely spent everything, a severe famine struck the country, and he found himself in dire need. So he hired himself out to one of the local citizens, who sent him to his farm to tend the swine. And he longed to eat his fill of the pods on which the swine fed, but nobody gave him any. Coming to his senses, he thought, "How many of my father's hired workers have more than enough food to eat? But here am I, dying from hunger. I shall get up and go to my father and say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you, and no longer deserve to be called your son. Treat me as you would treat one of your hired workers.' So he got up and went back to his father. While he was still a long way off, his father caught sight of him and was filled with compassion. He ran on to his son, embraced him, and kissed him. His son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you, and no longer deserve to be called your son.' But his father ordered his servants, 'Quickly, bring the finest robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Take the fattened calf and slaughter it. Then let us celebrate with a feast, because this son of mine was dead and has come to life again. He was lost and has been found.' Then the celebration began. Now the older son had been out in the field, and on his way back, as he neared the house, he heard the sound of music and dancing. He called one of the servants and asked what this might mean. The servant said to him, 'Your brother has returned, and your father has slaughtered the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound.' He became angry, and when he refused to enter the house, the father came out and pleaded with him. He said to his father in reply, 'Look, all these years I served you, and I did not once disobey your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat to feast on with my friends. But when your son returns, who swallowed up your property with prostitutes, for him you slaughter the fattened calf.' He said to him, 'My son, you are here with me always. Everything I have is yours. But now we must celebrate and rejoice, because your brother was dead and has come to life again. He was lost and has been found.'" The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, Lord Jesus. Please be seated. Well, first of all, welcome again to tonight's reflection, tonight's penitential service in preparation for Holy Week. Some gospel commentators refer to this passage not as the passage of the prodigal son, but as the parable of the merciful father, and I think there's some merit to that. Because of the 3 characters that are presented, the 2 sons represent 2 different ways of sinning, 2 different ways that we can be neglectful or sinful in our spiritual life. But the focal point, no matter what, is always the mercy, the love, the compassion of the Father, who never gives up on his children. And it's a beautiful analysis, and I will not, frankly, take too much credit, because a lot of what I'm saying probably comes indirectly from John Paul II. He wrote in one of his earlier encyclicals as Pope, Dives in Misericordia, which just means rich in mercy. He used this parable as his basis for the encyclical on mercy. And really for anybody who preaches retreats and stuff, this kind of turns into the go-to source. So if you really want a good analysis, go back and read Dives in Misericordia by John Paul II. A man had 2 sons. The younger son said to his father, "Father, give me the share of your estate that should come to me." That sounds reasonably innocuous on the surface of things. But if you read in between the lines, what is the son saying? Son is saying, "I know that you have raised me and given me the dignity of being your heir, of being your son, and I couldn't care less. And I am too impatient to even wait for you to die. I've been waiting for you to die for a long time now, and you simply refuse to do it, so I'm done waiting. Just give me my inheritance and let me go." That's essentially what his son is saying to him. What a gross insult to the face of the Father. And every time you and I sin, we essentially do the same thing. God made us in his image and his likeness. And actually the theologians make a distinction between image and likeness. The old church fathers, they love to distinguish those things. If you read in the Catechism, the image is basically the fact that we're spiritual beings, which means we're capable of God. You have a spiritual faculty with an intellect and a will. That image we will always have, because we're human and that's just part of our nature. The likeness, though, is something we can give up. The likeness is the state of grace. It is sanctifying grace in the soul that glorifies the human soul and ennobles us and allows us to participate in God's own life in us. And in that sense, you can say that the likeness is the inheritance, okay? It's the inheritance that God has given in this parable. So the son, well, every time you and I sin, we do that. We do the same thing as the son. We say, you know what? It's nice and everything that you made me in your image and likeness, but I want to do my own thing. You have become a burden to me. It's the same thing that Adam and Eve did, ultimately. God said, you can have freedom to take from any of the trees in the garden. Do it. It's all there for you. There's only one tree that I withhold the right to your just, doing what you want. That's the tree of knowledge of good and evil, because that is the realm that pertains to God. And instead of focusing on all the gifts that they had, Adam and Eve focused on the one prohibition, the one thing that God said no to. And you and I, we do that regularly. This is what the young man in the gospel parable does. He takes his eyes off of the fact that he is a son, and that how good his father is, and how many gifts, how much the Father has given him already. And he simply says, I want to do whatever I want to do on my own terms. And there's always that ingratitude. And interestingly enough, the Father does not stop the Son. He doesn't say, hey, wait a minute, hey, I'm the boss here. He could have said, first of all, you don't get the inheritance until the person is dead. That's just the way it works. Okay? The Father lets him have it. The Father, and he does the same thing with us. He says, you know what? I'm not going to force anybody here to be a saint. I'm not going to force any of you to love me. I'm not going to force any of you to be holy. I'm not going to force any of you to be happy either. If you want to, you can choose misery. You can choose the lifestyle that leads to being miserable. So after a few days, the younger son collects all his belongings and sets off to a distant country where he squanders his inheritance on a life of dissipation. You take the gifts that God has given us and we just kind of blow it. And again, every time we go out kind of dialoguing with sin, that's what we do. We expose it, we undervalue it, and eventually we just kind of blow the life of grace. Sometimes, I don't know, maybe when we were younger, college age, for example, it's like, you've already got in the back of your mind, okay, this weekend I'm really going to go out and tie one on. I'm really going to go out and, parties and whatever. You haven't sinned yet so much, but the decision is already there. And then you go out and sooner or later you take the life of God that dwells in your heart and you just blow it, the same way that this guy did. And when he had freely spent everything, a severe famine struck the country. He found himself in dire need. So he hired himself out to one of the local citizens, who sent him to his farm to tend the swine. Now think about this. Swine are an unclean animal for a Jew. This is in a Jewish context. What Jesus is saying is this guy was so reduced. It wasn't enough if he would have been out tending sheep or just doing field work or harvesting whatever, grapes for the wine press or anything. It could have even been difficult labor. It could have been digging ditches. But when it says, when you're in a Jewish context and it says, he was sent out to tend the swine. He was like the servant of the swine. That's as low as you can get. When we think about in our society, what happens when we embrace, I don't think anyone here has done so, but when we embrace radical lives of sin. Think about people who become slaves to drug addictions, slaves to prostitution, slaves to any, explicitly, blatantly sinful lifestyle. And in a certain sense, they are tending the swine. So he hires himself out, and he longs to eat his fill of the pods on which the swine fed. He's so hungry, he's in such a bad state that he envies the pigs. This is what a life of sin does to us. Interestingly enough, you think about the fact when God made us, in Genesis, he made us on the 6th day, which is the same day he made all the animals. So you were made on the same day as dogs and cats and parakeets and all those things, right? But he made us for the 7th day, which is the day of Sabbath rest, which really means the life of grace and union with God, the rest of soul that comes from when we live in intimacy with God. But when we choose to return back to the 6th day, in many regards, we don't just reduce ourselves to the level of animals, we actually reduce ourselves to something lower, because you actually voluntarily go there. And human beings who freely embrace sin do things much worse than what animals do. Animals follow an instinct. They may kill, they do certain things, but they follow an instinct. They do not explicitly seek out that which is evil. When you and I explicitly seek things that we know that are evil, we are, in many regards, worse than animals. And what happens is, he comes to his senses because he realizes what a miserable state he's in. And sin inevitably will do that to us. There have been many movies, for example, about people who, in a certain sense, more or less sell their souls, to business or in the mafia or in the drug cartels or whatever. And they become, they kill people and do whatever it takes to climb to the top. And they become wildly, quote unquote, successful in the sense that they have a lot of money and they have a lot of human power and influence. But you watch these people just deteriorate as human beings, and they always are miserable. Think of The Godfather, Michael Corleone. In the beginning of the movie, he knew that his family business was that. And the girl Kay, when she's asking about his family, and he kind of lets her know, hey, this is what my family does. And then he said to her, okay, that's my family, that's not me. And he didn't want anything to do with it until he got sucked in. And then you watch this constant degeneration. He went one step after another step after another step, and his marriage is destroyed, and you see him, he's miserable, he's unhappy. And at the end of both of the movies, especially the second one, you see him there just reminiscing on his childhood and the simpler days and all those things that are past, because he has destroyed it by his choices. And that means also that when you and I look upon people who are stuck in sinful lifestyles, rather than judge, we really need to have hearts of compassion, because it is a miserable place to be. So coming into his senses, he thinks, how many of my father's hired workers have more than enough food to eat, but here I am dying from hunger. I will get up and go to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I no longer deserve to be called your son. Treat me as you would treat me one of your hired workers. There's a beautiful conversion that takes place there. Now, he's still far from being wholly converted. But the beginning of the realization that, number one, I used to have it better off. Sin has reduced me to this. I need to go back to the house of the Father. And number two, there was the understanding intrinsically that my Father, one way or another, will take me back. Now, he didn't yet dare to ask to be brought back on the terms of a son, which means that he also didn't yet really understand his Father's heart. He says, bring me back as one of your hired servants, because even a hired servant is way better off than I am now. And when we begin to repent, a lot of the times, because it requires grace, a lot of the times we have this misconception of God. We have this fear of God. It's like, well, I guess I'm going to kind of go back, but I mean, Father's going to be mean to me, and then maybe God will never really, but I guess and we kind of come hesitatingly to confession, and we come like this young man and say, well, Father, I'm not worthy to come back in the status of a child, but just take me back any way you can. And it's a bittersweet thing, because on the one hand, God is so happy the fact that you're even able to do that, because once you begin that journey, once you at least turn your face back to him and we start taking steps and allow him to do whatever he wants, well then we're in a very good place. But there's also got to be that twinge of pain in the sense that doesn't this child of mine know me yet? Doesn't this child of mine trust me yet? That my love is greater than that, like I'm going to treat him like some hired servant? This is my child. You are my heir. You can't throw that away. Even if you try to, it's part of who you are. We are made in his image and likeness, and that is what we are destined for. And God will not be happy until we step back into the fullness of that relationship. So while he's still a long way off, his father caught sight of him and was filled with compassion. He ran to his son and embraced him and kissed him. I don't know how old the father was. With every year that passes, this sounds like more and more of a heroic thing to me. So I see somebody more than a block off, and if you mention the idea of running out to meet him, it's like maybe I would hop in the car and warm up the car and drive out and pick him up or something like that. But the father is perpetually on the lookout for the son, and when the son is a long way off, dragging himself back to the father's house, the father runs out to meet him. God does that. Whenever any of us, this is something important to remember, whenever any one of us feels the inclination even, I really need to get back to confession. I really need to get back to Mass. I really need to get back on my feet spiritually. The very fact that you feel that inclination, that did not come from you. And it certainly did not come from the devil. That is always God who takes the initiative. He is always the one who runs out. He's waiting for you. And even the smallest steps that we start taking, he's saying, okay, that's enough. There's openness. And he runs out like the father in this parable to embrace us. So that means that even if I'm feeling like the smallest little movement in my heart, I've really got to get back. I've got to reconcile with this person. I need to go to church, whatever. Take it. That is God saying, I love you. It's God touching your heart already. We are incapable on our own of even coming up with that kind of a thought. Only God can implant that grace in your heart, which means that he wants to give you his grace. He wants to give you his forgiveness. And we still come to him like, oh, this is going to be spooky and scary. Spooky and scary, nothing. He wants to bless you. He wants you to be happy. He wants you to live an abundant life. So his son says to him, "Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I no longer deserve to be called your son." And interestingly enough, his father's not even listening to him. So his father orders the servants, "Quickly, bring the finest robe, the robe of grace, and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger, the ring of authority, and sandals on his feet. Take the fattened calf and slaughter it. Let us celebrate with a feast, because this son of mine was dead and has come to life again. He was lost and has been found." That right there is the attitude that God has whenever we return to him in great or small ways. Any step of grace forward that we take, anytime we give God a yes, that is his attitude. He's like, heaven is rejoicing, saying, slaughter the fattened calf, okay? I don't know, maybe it's not such a good thing to be a cow in heaven, but C.S. Lewis once said, is it possible, one of his chapters in one of his books, he said, do animals get to go to heaven or animals go to hell, or, trying to reconcile it all. And he says, theoretically, I could probably reconcile hell for humans being heaven for mosquitoes. Maybe it's the same thing with cows, okay? Heaven for us is hell for the cows, because they know they're going to get slaughtered every time somebody does slaughter the fattened calf. Then the celebration began. So we've seen half of the family. And maybe some of you don't entirely identify with son number one. Maybe some of you are like, well, I do my bad stuff, like all sinners do, but maybe those are not my sins. Going out and, abandoning the church and living lives of sex and drugs and hedonism and blatant, bold sin, if you want. But there's another son in the story, and he's not much better, frankly. And he is the religious one. He's the one that represents, when Jesus was talking to the scribes and Pharisees, he's the one that represents them. The younger son, the hedonist, was the one that represents like the pagan, the Gentiles that were coming back to the kingdom. Now the older son is out in the field. As he nears the house, he hears the sound of music and dancing. He called one of the servants and asked what this might mean. The servant said to him, "Your brother has returned, and your father has slaughtered the fattened calf, because he has him back safe and sound." He became angry. And when he refused to enter the house, the father came out and pleaded with him. How many of us have experienced that sentiment? Somebody we know that is living a lifestyle they shouldn't be living, maybe doing things that they shouldn't be doing, has maybe caused family division. The black sheep in our family, the one that everyone else more or less gets along, and that one family member, maybe if there's an argument over an inheritance, and most of you are just like, well, okay, whatever mom and dad wanted, and the one is like being unreasonable, okay? If that person starts to change, how many of us have felt like, or if your parents were to show love to that person, how many of you would feel angry? And you can ask yourselves, or we can ask ourselves, why is that? Why would we feel angered when somebody who is in a bad place starts to convert and come back? And the answer is very simple. It's because we were never concerned about that person in the first place. We were only concerned about ourselves. And probably part of us almost enjoyed the fact that there was somebody who was doing things they shouldn't be doing, because that way I could counterpose myself, so to speak, and I could be the good guy. I'm not doing any of those bad things, and it could be all about me. And that's precisely what the older brother in this gospel passage is doing. His brother comes back. He's not even happy, because his father is rejoicing that my son has come back to life, and he's like, yeah, but what about me? You never pay any attention to me. And it's completely selfish. It is absolutely selfish, and it is a more subtle form of selfishness, but he's really not in a lot better place than what the younger son was when he ran off and did his thing. And in many regards, he's worse, not because the sins that he was committing in and of themselves were worse, but because the sins of self-righteousness, the real danger there is that we don't want to admit them. If you're like this other son, going off drinking and running off with loose women and doing whatever, you know you're sinning. You might want to hide, not face up to it and just bury it in more sin, but you know you're not going to deny before anybody that what you're doing is sinning. But when you're self-righteous, how easy it is to start getting defensive and digging in our heels and start making excuses and this is unjust. In all of it, in the end, comes down to my selfishness and my pettiness. So when the father runs out to him and pleads with him, he says, look, all these years I served you, and not once did I disobey your orders, yet you never even gave me a young goat to feast on with my friends. The father could have simply asked, did you ever ask? Would I have denied you? Did you even have the gumption to come to me and say, hey, Dad, I want to throw a party, it's my birthday, whatever? So the father says to him, my son, you are here with me always. Everything I have is yours. But now we must celebrate and rejoice because your brother was dead and has come to life again. He was lost and has been found. Both of the sons began with the same departure point. They had everything when they were in their father's house, and they didn't even pay attention to it. The second son, who has everything, and his father has to tell him, you're with me always, everything I have is yours, don't you know it? Don't you know it? And both of them only focused on the things that they thought that they were lacking. They never took stock of the gifts that God had given them. So the root of both of their sins ultimately is ingratitude. So what I would like to propose is, let's just take a few moments in silence for ourselves and perhaps reflect on this parable and what are the different ways that I have been either the first son, ungrateful and going out and squandering the things God gives me, or the second son and self-righteous and condemning and judgmental of others and wanting to be better. And then in a couple of minutes we will pray together the litanies. I will expose the Blessed Sacrament after a few prayers, and then we will begin confessing.